Welcome to Loyola Marymount University. I'm Fernando Guerra, Director and Professor of the Center for the Study of Los Angeles. We have with us today Gil Cedillo, currently a council member, formerly a state legislator, 8 years in the state Senate, 6 years in the state assembly. Because of term limits, he's come to the city of Los Angeles, and we're here to talk to him about that transition, everything he's been doing, and of course, a culmination of a lot of your professional elected activity in the signing of several bills by the governor at the end of this session. Driver's license bill.
Yes.
Not exactly the way you had first proposed it, but very close to that. A long time coming. All kinds of other immigrant rights type bills. So tell me, how did you feel when you heard? Because a day before the session was over, we're talking about September 2013, the day before the session was over, it was, everybody thought that the bill was dead. A bill carried by Assemblymember Luis Alejo from Salinas. He had pulled it and made it, quote unquote, a 2-year bill, and you'll talk about what that means. But for all intent and purposes, it was a dead bill. And that's what you knew. And then what did you hear?
Well, I knew that we had a governor willing to sign the bill. I knew that we had worked hard on the negotiations. I knew that he had committed himself to what essentially was the final product. I think this bill was a great bill. I think it's a lot better than the first bill I introduced, a lot better than many of the bills that were vetoed, very expansive, legally sound, and will provide safety and security for millions and millions of families. So I think it's a great bill, and I'm very
So what
happy
does
it's
it do
done.
specifically?
It allows undocumented motorists to drive legally in the state of California. They'll get a license, like a series of licenses that we issue that will permit them to drive. They'll give them a driving privilege, and it's very important in a state that doesn't rely on public transportation to allow people to drive legally, to end this specter, this kind of feeling that many immigrants had that every time they took to the streets that there was jeopardy in being stopped, jeopardy in having their vehicles towed away, and more jeopardy in the most recent years from being turned over to ICE and being deported.
I mean, to live in that constant fear is, we always talk about local government or government creating a quality of life, but when you have that constant fear, I don't care how well the streets are paved or the trees are trimmed, your quality of life is always constantly being threatened by any type of incident that could occur. Do you call yourself Latino, Mexican American, Mexicano, Chicano? What do you call yourself?
Gilbert. It depends on the context. It depends on
This is
on
a
the
Chicano
point.
studies class. Here's the
Understand.
context. So what do you call yourself?
It depends on the audience, because the whole point
A bunch
of the
of
label.
Chicano studies students.
The whole point of the label is to communicate your place in their world, right? I hope to be an audience-focused speaker, and so it depends. And so if I'm...
Are you a product of the Chicano movement?
I am a political product of the Chicano movement. I am a Mexican-American. I'm also part of a product of a diaspora of Mexicans who have come north from Mexico. And so it varies on the context.
But you're not an immigrant.
I am not an immigrant. I was born here, and my parents were born here. My grandparents came from Mexico post-revolution.
So you're third, in some situations, fourth generation. Why have immigrant rights been so important to you?
They're important to me, I think, in part because of being a product of the Chicano movement, of having that sense of being an outsider, of trying to find a place in American society, a place where we're accepted. They were important to me as I looked at the diversity within my family. Mixed marriages, ethnically mixed, also change and changing immigration status. One of my grandfathers was undocumented his whole time here. And so it's complex, and so it depends on the circumstance in terms of how I define myself and see myself, because there's a lot of complexity there. But immigration politics are important for us as Latinos in the broader category, because you can't divide your family in many instances, just to break it down in a very simple way. And So if you think you can be silent or quiet about what happens to immigrants, and that somehow because you become a professional, whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or whatever the case may be, and somehow you can separate yourself from that, I think you're mistaken. And I think I've seen that, and I think people are mistaken when they think that they can make that separation.
What took so long to get this legislation passed, or even take us back? Because growing up in the 70s and 80s, undocumented immigrants could get driver's license. So are we talking that California back in the 70s and 80s was more progressive than California in the 90s, in the first decade of 2000? What was going on?
I think they were smarter in many instances.
Who was smarter? The California?
California was much smarter in the 60s and 70s. In some instances, that's when we expanded public education. We expanded services for all people in California. Immigrants and all people in California, since the inception of the Department of Motor Vehicles for over 60 years, our strategy was to have every motorist and every vehicle licensed and tested. And that was our strategy for safe highways. This bill had, at its core, was essentially just a bill about highway safety. But unfortunately, tragically...
But that was strategic. I mean, it's really a bill about symbolism, about the integration of Mexicans, Latinos,
Correct.
and other immigrants into
Correct.
California society.
Correct. This bill, with a bad economy in the early 90s, as in many instances in California's history, when there's a bad economy, there's also bad politics. And so, unfortunately, the Democrats in Sacramento wanted to respond to what was going on at the time. There's a bad economy. Many people were blaming immigrants, scapegoating immigrants. And so the Democrats, led by Al Alquist, came up with this bill to take away the driver's license from immigrants because they thought they were doing something and somehow that this would deter immigrants from coming. That's a really pretty dumb argument.
And wasn't it also an electoral strategy to try to, quote unquote, go to the center and try maybe even a little bit to the right for Democrats and be able to pick up some votes, or at least not appear to be so liberal? And because even some Latinos voted for this. Some Latinos were actually very much in favor of this. The man that you replaced in the state assembly
carried this bill.
Carried this bill.
Yes.
A Latino in a predominantly Latino district carried a bill to take away driver's license from undocumented immigrants.
Yes.
Explain that.
He did, and many liberals, many Democrats, many Latinos. I think at the time people were bullied, that there was a hysteria.
Okay, but leaders aren't supposed to be bullied.
No, they're not. They shouldn't. And some didn't, but many were. Many were bullied by the politics of the time. The number and the political power of Latinos was modest at the time. And there were a few people who would and could stand up to resist this. And so as a result, we took away the driver's license. It was supposed to stop immigration, and it didn't. The next 3 years, immigration increased. It made our highways, which were the safest in the nation, and realized that we have 24, 25 million people take to the highways every day. We need them to be safe. We need them to know the rules. We need them to know the customs and practices of our highways. We made it illegal for 10% of them to drive legally. And our highways went from being the safest in the nation, and our highways went from being the safest in the nation to being some of the most unsafe. Hit and runs, the numbers of hit and runs increased, and it's been a total disaster. I'm very, very excited, proud that the governor saw that this was a foolish policy and that we corrected it.
So going back to that day in September when you heard that it was going to come back up, how did you feel?
Well, I was a little infuriated because...
That's not what I expected to hear. I expected to hear that you were very happy. What do you mean you're infuriated?
Oh, no, that the bill was coming up? Or
that
it was going to be heard.
Yeah.
Well, I had been infuriated because I had read, the LA Times had announced that they were going to make it a 2-year bill.
You should read La Opinión. That way you get the right information.
I think they have inside information. And so I was infuriated that the bill was being put down because we were continuing to work with the governor's office and legislators to move the bill. The next morning, I was very excited to work with Senator De Leon and Senator Lara on a strategy to move the bill and place it back in the lower house.
So let me shift back. We talked about you not being an immigrant. You're actually third or fourth generation.
Yes.
From a political perspective, we're doing a project here at Loyola Marymount University that we call the PowerPoint Project, and it's actually being sponsored by Cordova Corporation and George Plough. And part of that, when I take a look at that project, there's Ed Roybal. And we've talked a little bit in class with students about Ed Roybal, first elected in 1949, a council member, then a congressman for many, many years. It's like he's like the grandfather of Latino politics. Then came a generation of people like Richard Alatorre and Art Torres and that group. And I consider you to be, and I really call that the first generation, because Roybal's an outlier. He was the only one. You can't call one person a generation. You can't call one person a movement. Well, maybe you can with him, but certainly the next kind of group where there was 5, 6, 7 of them, and also a cadre of other individuals that helped them get elected. And you and a couple of others, and I will put Antonio Villaraigosa and Richard Polanco, and I call you, from my perspective, the 1.5 generation of Latino politics in LA and in Southern California. How you watched these guys first get elected, right? And you were part of that. You were certainly active in some of that. What lessons did you learn from that first generation that prompted you to want to run for public office?
So my history comes more from the labor movement.
Right.
And so as big as Roybal was to us, and he was, my first job, in fact, was working at CSO with Tony Rios, who was
CSO is the
community service organization that Fred Ross, Al Linsky, Tony Rios, and others created.
That Cesar Chavez at one point worked for as well.
Cesar Chavez worked for. So Ed Roybal was elected to that effort. But I came from the labor movement. I was very much influenced by Burt Corona. And so as a young college student, I was less focused on electoral politics than I was on organizing and mobilizing, much like if you spoke to a dreamer today.
Yeah.
This is their focus. It's not.
So you were
on the
basically
politics.
a machista.
I was definitely a machista, and I was very focused on mobilizing and organizing. From undergrad, I went to law school with the goal of becoming a labor lawyer and working with insurgent unions. I worked with an independent union called the IBGW, Local 301.
IBGW.
International Brotherhood of General Workers, Local 301. It was a local out of Chicago that was that we were working with so that we could organize undocumented workers. Undocumented workers were not brought into the AFL-CIO. In fact, they were seen
as a threat.
As a threat. In fact, even as a threat to the United Farm Workers in some instances. Yeah. And so that's the journey.
We need to contextualize that. They were seen as a threat because they undermined the organizing efforts, was the theory that
was the argument.
That was the argument, right? Yeah. Right.
We don't accept
but
that.
But even Cesar Chavez accepted that argument for a while.
Yes, he was. He was a proponent of that argument.
Yeah.
That's the history.
So you're a union activist. You get elected to become president of a local.
Yes.
Okay.
So I left law school. I went to organize a hospital not far from here, and worked with a lot of young people that I was in college with, who then went on to work in other unions. Antonio Villaraigosa working at United Teachers. Myself.
Yeah, but he wasn't Antonio Villaraigosa then.
Antonio Villar, and then Antonio Villaraigosa. My friends like Steve Holguin and Jesus Quiñones, who are labor lawyers. Maria Elena Durazo, who also went to People's College of Law and went on to work at hotel and restaurant employees. So many of us were idealistic about labor and the influence that organized labor could have on politics, and less focused on electoral politics.
Yeah, but labor, just like corporate America, just like politics, was pretty white then. We already mentioned it was anti-immigrant.
Yes.
It wasn't that welcoming to Latinos.
Not
it wasn't incorporating Latinos. So why were you so optimistic about the labor movement and joining that and kind of rationalizing what they had done to that particular point?
I think we had a great sense of confidence. I think we had an appreciation for demographics, and we recognized that there was going to be change. When we were younger, we were very fortunate to run, you'll like this, we were very fortunate to run into young, thoughtful people who were professors and demographers and gave us an indication that what change was going to take place within our lifetimes. And so we felt positive about that. So that's what gave us a sense that we could have an influence in the American labor movement.
So you're a union leader and you lose your job. Tell us about that.
You know, I was very interested in working with the union and unions, but to expand their kind of trajectory, to expand their policies. And it's, you know, the labor movement can be very conservative. And I kept bumping up against the leadership of my local. And at some point, they decided that they had had enough of our success. They had had enough of our success because we had won strikes, we had saved the healthcare system, we had increased the numbers, and we had created a very powerful local in Southern California. But, you know, I had difficulty getting them to embrace that.
So how old are you when you get fired? Or outvoted or thrown out, or what's the right word when you lose your job?
Depends on the context, right? I left abruptly. I think I was 42 maybe.
So what lessons at 42, leadership lessons, did you learn about being a union leader?
I learned, well, about being a union leader. Unions are very conservative. Change is difficult. You have to appreciate who you work for. I think one thing about the labor movement.
So wait, let me talk. Change is difficult. Is it because there's incremental change and you're not necessarily for that? You wanted to go faster? What's the possibility for change? Does it have to be revolutionary change, or is it change just controlled by elites and whatever they want?
Change comes very slowly in the labor movement, and it's an institution that protects itself and its institutional leaders. You have to realize one thing I learned about labor leaders is that they are adverse to risk. And they're adverse to risk because many of them come up through the rank and file. And this is the greatest job they'll ever have. And so there's a culture of leadership that is very reluctant to do anything different. They're kind of like the members in Congress, the Republican members of Congress who fear they're extremists and go along with policies that aren't really going to help them in the future, but they go along with them because they know that's the only way they can preserve themselves. And so on the other side, on the left, union leaders are that way. And so they respond to their membership, and their membership is very focused on day-to-day issues and not concerned about trends and change. And so they are, you know, they're very conservative in that respect. So
you get fired.
Yes, I get fired.
Okay.
Did anybody not hear that I got fired? I got fired. It was in the front page of the Los Angeles Times. It was April 30th in La Piñon. And yes.
Okay, so then what? What do you do? How do you pay the bills?
Well,
what do you do that next Monday morning?
Yeah, well, we engaged foolishly.
We went to court, right? And
a big fight back, and we had all the support. And, you know, engaged in the big fight back, and we generated the support that we had, and we tried to initiate an election within our union using the bylaws, and trying to change the bylaws. That didn't work.
What year is this?
This is 1996.
Right. So then, you know, you got nothing else to do, so might as well run for public office.
I didn't learn off the first time. I actually went to work for another union, United Food and Commercial Workers.
That's right.
And worked with them on strategic planning and helping them address the changing demographics within their industry.
Yeah. How'd you get fired from that job?
Well, like I said, no good deed goes unpunished in labor. And so it was, again, I was having differences with the leadership over how fast we could do things. And there was this opportunity to run for office, and Luis Caldera had been called by the president to go serve American Service.
AmeriCorps
program.
So Luis Caldera,
yes,
who's the assembly member,
yes,
graduate of Harvard, West Point, couldn't get into Loyola Marymount. That's where he had to go over there.
Right.
And then he gets appointed by President Clinton to become the director of AmeriCorps, which is kind of like the Peace Corps in the U.S.
Yes.
Right. And so it leaves a vacancy, and you decide to run.
Yes.
But you're not the favorite.
No, I'm not.
No. As I remember people asking me why I was supporting you, like I always support losers.
Right.
They would tell me, and why are you always supporting these idealist progressives who don't stand a chance?
Right.
So, hey, but not only did you win, you actually won convincingly.
Yes, 2-1.
2-1. I mean, what was that about? You were not supposed to win. Not
Right.
only did you win, but you won by quite a bit. Well, tell me about the campaign.
Well, I think the campaign was based upon what I think is a winning strategy
1997,
today.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
What is a winning strategy today, why Jerry Brown is the governor, is because we recognize that with those changing demographics, immigrants are here, some of them undocumented, have children, the children turn 18, and they vote. And we have been very involved in the efforts to defeat Proposition 187. And out of that, we developed a very popular base amongst the immigrant community. We were also very involved in an effort to save the public health care system the following year. And people saw us as champions for those communities that were poor, were lacking representation, were without a political voice. And so that base served as our base. We had over 1,000 volunteers, many of them, probably the majority of them undocumented, but they were willing to knock on doors, to make phone calls, and to turn out voters that did not normally participate. That strategy worked for us then. It worked for me just recently in my city council race, where we, in the districts of the poorest people of the city, the people who participate the least, but who had confidence in our campaign, voted 80-20 and helped us win a very difficult and close election. Back then, this electorate had been untested. It surprised everybody, all the pundits, and we were able to prevail 2-1 over a sitting school board member, former school board president, one highly backed by the most prominent elected officials.
And that described basically California.
That was California.
At that point. Very similar to not too recent, 2-3 years ago after the 2007-2008 meltdown. Also, and before that, when you think about real estate downturn in California, the last one is back then. So as you mentioned, economic hard times oftentimes create these type of political movements.
I think also, though, that it's not, when I look at the people who are scared, people who are having difficulties with change, I see the same thing in the Tea Party people. That these people are scared, they're having difficulty with change, and they're trying to cling on to some past that in many instances didn't really exist, but they believe that there were some better times in the past, and that are really frightened by a future that is different than what they grew up thinking.
But now, so you get elected in 1997. You go up to Sacramento.
Yes.
Okay, and the Latino, so in 1990, there's basically 3 Latinos out of the 80 assembly members and 2 in the state Senate. And by 92, that increases to about 7. In 96 to about 14. By the time you get there, you're like the 15th or so. And it's getting up to the 20s within your first term or second term. And it becomes a real power. There's the election of Antonio Villaraigosa. Before that, Cruz Bustamante to the speakership, Antonio Villaraigosa. So Latinos are a real power. And there's a sense that there's cohesion, and there's that Latino caucus. And of course, the leader of the Latino caucus, Richard Polanco. There seemed to be a unity that I frankly don't see there anymore. Or am I mistaken about that? Because you were just there a year ago, and you were part of the Latino caucus, one of the leaders of the Latino caucus. And many of us, I include myself in this, are very critical of the Latino caucus in the last 5 to 6 years. I mean, I can pinpoint case after case where the Richard Polanco Latino caucus wouldn't have allowed that to happen.
Correct.
Why does the Latino caucus become weaker with more members after it passes a certain threshold?
Because it's more diverse, because it's more integrated, because it's easier to organize a smaller group. And so it's just a function of the numbers. I mean, it's easier to control a smaller group. It's easier for a smaller group to be united around this concept of us against them.
Yeah.
And when you have a large group,
so you
like
agree with the
today,
premise of my question that the Latino caucus is weaker now than it was 10 years ago?
I think
Even though it
depends.
has more numbers.
I think it depends. I mean, they played a very, very major role in moving the bill at the end of this session back to the Assembly and to the governor's desk, and I think that's remarkable. When I was there, we played a very major role in moving water policy for the state of California. Very, very significant, very important. I think that's significant. So I think it depends. On the other hand, you can't control a larger number as you can a smaller number. A lot of it was dependent upon the charisma of Richard Polanco, the fact that he was central to their elections, and many people were dependent upon him, his political leadership. That's not the case today. I mean, it's a very diverse group of people. Some are moderates, some are conservatives, some are liberal. They reflect the districts that they're elected from. So when you're elected from, the Central Valley, and you're Latino, you're going to be conservative, and it's just required for you to...
It's in the water or what?
Well, it's a more conservative part. It's not an urban center. It's not LA. It's not San Francisco. It's not the border. So it's just the political realities.
So when you think back, when you first really gained political consciousness at UCLA and then later in the unions and you first got elected, there was a tremendous... You have lived this power shift, the incorporation of Latinos into LA, California politics.
Yes.
They are a presence today. They're in leadership roles. They set the agenda in some respects, not in complete control, but very significant component. What difference has it made that Latinos are now part of the ruling coalition in Sacramento, in the city of LA, in all kinds of different cities throughout California? Can we see some measurable difference that Latino elected leaders have made?
Yes. I think when we think about the question of the place of undocumented immigrants in California society versus, let's say, Arizona or anywhere else.
Well, Texas is always a good comparison because the populations are a little bit similar in terms of size. California is a little bit larger. But in terms of elected leaders, there's almost as many in the state legislature in Texas as there are here in California. But Latino elected officials in Texas are nowhere near as effective statewide. There's pockets, San Antonio, et cetera, but very, very different.
And I think in many instances in the past, so they were probably maybe ahead of California and probably more traditionally rooted in the politics of the state. New Mexico also. But today in California, I think the place that immigrants hold in the mainstream of California society, a good place where you, even though you're undocumented, you're educated, you can go to the finest universities, we will give you scholarships, and now we will allow you to become the professionals that you've been trained to become, that immigrants can drive again legally, that in California we're not going to allow our infrastructure of law enforcement to be an extension of the federal policies and deport families and accumulate the greatest number of deportations ever in the history of this nation. That basically you have some type of sanctuary in a very real and concrete way in California is a product of the politics, growth of the politics of the Latino community.
So do you have a Twitter account?
I do.
What's your latest tweet?
I couldn't tell you because I don't.
Okay, well, I'm going to let you tweet some more. Okay. So remember
it's going to be my staff.
Well, they're going to tweet for you right now. Okay. Remember Twitter, 140 characters.
Okay.
Okay. So I want you to tweet about Richard Alatorre.
Okay. So what I say, at Remarkable Man, at Trailblazer, at a man who's done so much that he doesn't get credit for.
So why is he a trailblazer? What about him?
I think he's. You're going to be surprised to hear this. I think he's an incredible wonkish man. And I think
because people always project him as behind the scenes, et cetera, that it was pure power politics.
Yeah. I think he's very much a wonk. I think he is very enamored with the details of policy, particularly in redistricting, right, which is kind of a wonky subject, maps, demographics.
Okay, so Richard Alatorre, we're talking about, former state assembly member, longtime LA City Council member, a long time, they use sometimes the word, I always think of it as positive, but many people use it negatively, godfather of politics in East LA. So what made him remarkable in terms of when you think about accomplishments?
Well, I think his biggest accomplishments are tied to redistricting and creating circumstances that Latinos could be elected. Both he and then Polanco. I guess he created the framework, and then Polanco helped execute that framework for that change. And I think that's in itself is very, very significant. He, has his own remarkable story. He was working at a university at a very young age. He was working with the NAACP at a very young age. He was a trailblazer in so many areas. He helped write and work on the legislation, the ARLB for the United Farm Workers. He was close to Cesar Chavez early on. I mean, he's a really historic figure in California politics.
Yeah, I think I was like 10 years old when I met him. I was sitting in my front yard, and he and Art Torres came knocking on the door. And I opened the door, and there's these two guys, and like, what do you guys want? They're wearing suits. Latinos wearing suits always make me nervous. Anybody wearing suits always made me nervous in my neighborhood. And they asked for my dad. That really made me nervous. And of course, they were there to ask for his vote. My dad talked to him for a while and whatever, and I like asked him, well, what do you think of those guys? He goes, and they just want my vote. And like, oh, you're going to give it to him? He goes, absolutely. So he was totally for them. Antonio Villaraigosa.
Also his historic figure, very charismatic, tremendous vision, a quick study.
Is that 140 characters? Or is it a little bit?
That's what I think.
When did you first meet him?
Oh, I met him when I was 15 years old.
What were you guys doing?
I was going to class, and he was surrounded with a bunch of people, had the stairwell clogged up with a bunch
Collecting
of
your lunch money?
Not mine, but others, I guess. I don't know.
It's called campaign contributions.
Early contributions. We had a great time. We met in high school. You guys will be familiar with it. It's always an outspoken person has to always have a more quiet, introverted person. So you can imagine.
So you're the introvert?
You can imagine who the outspoken person was.
Clearly, you can see him as the outspoken, but it's hard to imagine you as the introvert. Then you guys both go to UCLA?
Yeah, we had a great time in high school, and then through a program called Upward Bound, I spent 3 summers on the UCLA campus, and he would come and visit. I think both of us were inspired. He had, stumbled along a little bit, but he's very smart. Spent most of his life in private school and Catholic school, so he was very smart with great fundamental skills. So he.
Yeah, most kids in Catholic schools are very smart.
Yes, they are. Yeah. Good writers.
Yeah.
So he took a route to East LA College. He's older than I am, and so we met again back at UCLA. So we went to UCLA together.
Another Twitter.
Had a good time there.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. We don't need to go into those stories. It's a family program. Esteban Torres, former Congress member, original founder of Telacu, union guy.
Yep. Esteban and that group of guys out of the UAW, I really admired them.
So UAW, United Auto Workers.
United Auto Workers.
A union.
Those guys were the guys I looked up to. Hank Lacayo, Esteban. Those guys I really admired.
Hank Lacayo was another UAW.
UAW, Carter appointee.
Right.
And so I saw those guys in terms of as I began to think about going beyond labor as role models and examples of how I might go forward.
Because I think he was appointed to as an ambassador, right,
Yes.
to UNESCO at one
Exactly,
point. Also a
exactly.
congressman, like we mentioned, but he started in the labor union just like
Yep.
like you did,
And was with the Ruther brothers, who were very
out of Michigan.
liberal guys in the labor movement.
Yeah. Let me ask you about a couple of organizations. MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Yes.
Let's give me a tweet about them.
Focused, legal, committed.
What are they focused on?
Well, they're focused on the issues of the Latino community, and they're focused on their legal strategies.
So they're not a general membership organization. They're really just like the law firm for the
Yes,
Latino community.
exactly.
Right?
They
And
are.
they determine what they're going to go after.
Yes,
You know,
they do.
You can't go up there and call them and say, "Hey, I have trouble. I can't. Can you sue somebody for me, or I'm being sued?" They don't take on individual cases. They take on cases that are community-wide, like
Correct.
redistricting and
Exactly.
other type of things. So
they use the law for public policy purposes. It's much like the school I went to, which was designed for people interested in using the law for change.
how about another tweet? Univision.
Univision, huge, right? Very important.
When did you become, because I know growing up, the only thing, well, Univision didn't exist actually when I was growing up.
KMEX.
Yeah, it was KMEX, Channel 34. And the only thing I knew about Channel 34 is that my mom or dad were watching it and I wanted to change it. It's like they always had these programs that like, come on, man, another Cantinflas movie.
Right.
It was like.
Another cowboy?
Another cowboy, or et cetera.
More horses? Don't they have cars?
Right. But then later on, I became much more conscious of what it meant. When did you become conscious of the role that Univision plays and how different that role is for the media in non-Latino communities?
So I shared your experiences. I grew up
You
in a
wanted to change
household.
that channel,
I
too,
wanted
huh?
to change that channel because I grew up in a household where, because of the experiences of my parents, how they had to deal with racism, how they how they were unable to go to school and how they wanted us to do well in school, did not speak Spanish to us at all. Although they were fluently bilingual, they never spoke to us in Spanish, and as a result, we never learned Spanish. And that was intentional. They wanted us to go to school and do well and have better lives than theirs, and so.
And they associated not knowing Spanish, not necessarily knowing English, but not knowing Spanish as being the road to influence and affluence.
Well, speaking English well and being able to do well in school was the strategy, generational strategy. And so like you, I grew up and wanted to change the channel and had no sense for what the Spanish language media did and the role it played in our community, not until Proposition 187.
Right.
And then I saw that, we live in parallel worlds in some respects. And there's a Spanish-speaking world that exists in this country that goes on 100% Spanish-speaking and has electronic, more than a dozen stations that give you sports, entertainment, news, and we have a daily like L'Opinion that does the same thing. And that's freestanding of what goes on in the English language medium.
Well, you beat me to my last Twitter, which is La Opinión.
L'Opinion.
140 characters.
Right, at very important, at Monica Lozano, at invaluable.
So it is. I get the sense about these parallel worlds that's starting to differ. That's starting to merge. So I used to give an assignment many years ago. For a week, I would have the students read the LA Times and La Opinión on the front page and find out to what extent they were covering the same stories. It was remarkable. There were days when not a single story was the same, not a single one.
Yeah.
Okay. Increasingly, though, that's not the case. So, is it the LA Times that's changing, or La Opinión that's changing, or both?
It would have to probably be the LA Times, I imagine. But it's not just the stories they cover; it's also the way that they cover them. And So today, my perspective is that the English language media is this gotcha medium, particularly in the print media, and that it's very hostile, right? Whereas that's not the case in terms of the Spanish language medium, that it's kind of a community-based, community-focused, informative, positive type of medium. And the English language medium is not that. It's all about scandal and hysteria and gotcha, and it's very hostile to public figures.
So in Chicano studies and some of the other social sciences, we always talk about lag time. And so first we talk about the demographic shift or immigration, the number of Latinos, Asians, and others who have come and really changed the face of the cities and the state. After that, it's always, and it's not just for Latinos, it also played out in East Coast cities with European ethnics. You'd get political incorporation and empowerment. What we're calling here the power shift that we've been talking about. And that has clearly happened, right? And it's continuing to happen. The third stage that we often talk about then is economic integration and the emergence of powerful ethnic companies like La Opinión, Univision, but also more importantly, businesses that whether they're construction management businesses or investment banks or what have you. Do you see that growth is happening just like 20 years ago we started seeing the shift of the political power? Are you seeing the shift, the emergence of the Latino business community?
I see an emergence, although probably not at the same rate or pace of other areas, clearly not the same as politics, and probably not at the levels. And then there's also the parallel worlds, right? There's, creation of upstarts and some wealth here, but there's also a lot of, say, Mexican money here that exists, freestanding.
But you've been an elected official in Los Angeles for a long time.
Yes.
And you've seen a lot of different communities. Just in your political lifetime, not your lifetime, we've seen the emergence of Korean community demographically and then economically. I mean, incredibly powerful economic community,
right?
But not for Mexicans. We've seen the arrival of almost non-existent Persian or Iranian community before 1979. Now they're here, incredibly powerful and successful. The Armenian community, almost non-existent, now over 300,000 strong. Again, incredibly economically powerful.
Yes.
Last week we had Councilwoman Sally Flowers from Artesia, and we talked about the Indian, that is the subcontinent Indian community in her city and the impact that they have had on that city. Incredibly economically powerful. I keep going on and on, about other communities as well. Obviously the Chinese community and the impact that it's had on Monterey Park, San Marino, you can name it and name it. Where is the economic, powerful Latino community? Why are Latinos, specifically Mexicans, the exception to the scenario that we keep seeing in the city of Los Angeles?
Well, I don't know that they're exclusively the exception, right? So Salvadorans and Guatemalans and others, right?
Okay, so all Latinos then. Why are,
So
what is it about Latinos that we don't have this economic success that you've seen in other immigrant communities?
Well, one would be access to capital. And so I don't see a lot of Mexican banks following or coming here and opening up. But in K-Town, you see a lot of Korean banks.
Right.
So capital is coming here. You don't see Mexican capital coming to the United States. They're making itself accessible to an emerging middle class of Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants or groups like that. So if you don't have access to capital, it's difficult to build wealth.
Right.
And I think that's the fundamental difference I tell. Because there's a little tension between, will you stop that? Between Central Americans, Salvadorans, and Koreans, as they the Korean community grows and comes into these areas that people thought were these established Central American corridors, although they're only about 30 years old. So there's a stress and a tension, but it really is happening only because the Koreans have capital and are able to continue to move, buy, rent spaces, buy spaces, open up coffee shops, open up businesses, and respond to demands within the Korean community.
Mm-hmm.
And Salvadorans don't have that capital. They don't have that access to the capital. And so,
We are at Loyola Marymount University having a discussion or a conversation with Councilmember Gil Cedillo, talking about all kinds of experiences that he's enjoyed throughout his public life. The most recent, of course, is your election to the Los Angeles City Council.
Yes.
You are a state legislator.
Yes.
You are known throughout the state. I've been with you where people come up to you and talk about, immigrants of all types come
Yes.
talk to you about how you are their favorite elected official. How do you go from the state legislature to a dinky city council position?
Well, it's not really a dinky city council. It's not a, there on Tuesday night with half a dozen people. It's, the most important city, arguably in the nation, most important in the state. It's 4 million people. And it plays a very important role in the economic development of both the city and the entire region. And this is the Pacific Rim. So it's not, as some people would think, a step down. It's just a different position. It's a step over.
Right. I mean, obviously it isn't a step down. How many former state legislators are serving on the LA
Half
City
the council.
Half the council, so
Right.
7?
And I think that's a good thing.
You think it's a good thing?
I think it's a good thing because their experience at making decisions, their experience at working together, they have a sense for the role of the city within the state. They understand global economics and the importance of the decisions we make. So I think it enriches the important decision making within the city council.
In the state, most work and legislation doesn't actually happen on the floor of the state legislature.
Yes.
But at the city council, a lot of the work does happen on the floor.
It does.
Explain the difference and the dynamics of that.
The state is very structured. It has a start date. Every bill has to be addressed 6 times. You go through a policy committee, you go through a fiscal committee, you go to the floor, and then you do the same thing on the other house. If there's an amendment, it comes back. And so it's a very structured, and a session lasts 2 years. And so you know the start date, the end date. In the city council, you could have an idea on Monday, have it heard on Tuesday, and be voting on it on Friday.
Sounds efficient to me.
It sounds efficient. I'm not yet fully appreciative of how those decisions get executed. I have yet to see that. And so, we'll see. On the other hand, I think there's a benefit when matters can be fully vetted and deliberated upon. Less likely to have to bring them back.
Oh, but now, there's 7 of you from the state legislature
Yes.
on the city council, and one of them is actually the president of the city
Yes.
council. Can't you try to change some of those rules and procedures? Is there a movement to do that?
I don't know if there's a movement. I think some of us are, interested in some changes. But, it's a different entity. It's a different institution. We have to respect some of the parameters of the institution.
I've talked to some current city council members that didn't come from the state legislature that are there now, and they say that they do see the difference that the new legislators have, the new council members, former legislators have made, and they actually think it's pretty positive, that it's much more informative, the type of questions that are asked and the process. And this particular member is like very happy to be part of that process. So we talked about how structured it is and the difference, but it's also partisan difference. In the state legislature, it is partisan. You have
Yes.
Democrats, Republicans. By state law, in a city council, you cannot run as a Democrat or Republican. Everybody runs in a nonpartisan venue. But everybody knows who's a Democrat or a Republican.
Yes.
We had Mario Guerra, the mayor of Downey, who everybody knows is a Republican. Everybody knows that you are a Democrat or machista or whatever you want to be called. He said that a little bit earlier.
You said that.
Oh, I said that? But you agreed. You
I
said
agreed.
you were.
I acknowledged
okay,
it, yes.
Let's just be clear. Are you a machista or
Yeah,
not?
I was a machista.
Okay,
yes, I was.
okay. Let's get that out of the way. But in Of the 15 council members, only one's a Republican, right?
I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah, you can look it up. You can go to your individual registration and see what you're registered as.
Okay.
Okay, and I could look you up, and you're registered as a Democrat.
Right.
And there is one council member who's registered as
Englander?
yes. Okay.
And Bruscaino?
No, he's they're registered declined to state.
And Parks?
Parks is a Democrat, registered Democrat. He may vote every once in a while like a Republican, but he's
fiscally prudent.
He's very fiscally prudent. He should be the budget czar.
He should be.
So the partisanship is different. It's
Yes.
a nonpartisan environment, but it's all Democrats.
Right.
Okay, and so there was always this fear that when Democrats got 2/3 of the vote in the state legislature, that they would act in a certain way. Well, that's been the case in L.A. City. I mean, they're all the fight in L.A. City is between the progressive liberals and the moderates.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very different dynamic. How does that play out so far in what you've seen?
Well, the subject matter is different. I don't know what the Republican Democratic position is on potholes, right? Mm-hmm. So that's like an area where
Well, it's easy, man. The Democratic position is that unions will have to hire to fill them. The Republican position is that you privatize it to fill them.
There you go. Very good. That's very informative. The problems that come before us, we have to work together and we look for solutions that we can agree upon. It's always about counting the votes. There is some deference for jurisdiction for your districts, but in my experience in 16 years in the legislature and legislative bodies, it's always about counting the votes and getting the support for your idea and your agenda.
Yeah. Going back to the state legislature, what vote that you take do you regret that it turned out differently, unintended consequences, and you wish, man, I wish I hadn't voted that way. I wish that bill hadn't passed. We were all for it, et cetera, but I regret taking that vote.
None, but I will say
that can't
this.
be true.
It's true.
Okay, how many votes did you take in the state of California? How many
100,000 probably.
Okay, 100,000? You were 100,000 for 100,000? You should be playing for the Dodgers. There's not one vote you regretted.
No, I don't think so.
I find that hard to believe.
I voted consistent with my values, consistent with
Yeah, but you
the
can vote
groups that I
consistent
work
with your values, and there was unintended consequences of a piece of legislation, that we didn't realize it was going to do a certain thing,
I will tell you a circumstance that was.
Because it doesn't matter if you're worried about someone using that
No,
word.
no, no,
They
no,
could
no,
take
no,
any.
no.
They could take any
History,
vote.
history has absolved me. History has absolved me. So listen to this. I made a deal with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I thought you were going to say I made a deal with the devil. But go ahead.
Same difference as the devil would say. I made a deal with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it was a deal that was supported by SEIU, Justice for Janitors, HERE, CHIRLA, and everybody agreed that it was important to go and make an agreement with Schwarzenegger to avert him repealing the bill. Had he repealed the bill, it would have been in the Constitution, and we never would have been able to get a driver's license today. That was troubling because he reneged. He made an agreement, and then he just went sideways on it. So that was troubling. It was something that I believed in. I would do again, and I'm glad I did it. But it was very troubling to be.
So, what leadership lesson did you get from that?
What's that thing that Ronald Reagan said? Trust but confirm.
Verify.
Trust but verify.
Yeah, trust but verify.
Trust but verify.
So, when you think about other political moments, not necessarily a vote, are there moments that you regret? Do you regret running for Congress and losing?
No, I don't regret losing.
You got to regret losing. Maybe you don't regret running.
No, I don't regret losing, because I think losing can be very informative. I think it can be very, very helpful, and I learned a lot from that race. It was unfortunate, but I think not only did I lose, but I think our community lost in terms of the broader Latino community. We don't have a voice or place there in Washington today on the immigration question that I think it's a place that we would have done well had we won the election. But, I'm happy to be home. I said this to my mother once because that district was beyond the reaches of my politics.
Pretty far east.
Yeah, pretty far east and pretty far, right. And so it was difficult and challenging to run. And it's just a different community.
So what was the assessment that you made when you decided to run?
Well, I was kind of drafted in some respects.
Yeah.
There was a discussion. There were several candidates, and then they chose different routes, and they said, you should be the candidate. And I was happy to do it. It was a difficult race, much like the last one. Difficult for different reasons. Having to go against labor, having to go against very prominent members of our community, the mayor, the head of labor.
Two people that you earlier mentioned as an early part of your life.
Yes. To go against both Maria Elena Durazo, Antonio Villaraigosa, everybody, the Secretary of Labor, the entire environmental community, the entire Democratic community. Those were
Well, you sound like a Republican.
Difficult.
So see, the labor was against you, the environmentalists were against you. It's like, who was for you?
The people were for me. Those who sought a voice and sought someone who would advocate for them.
So would you do it again?
Yeah, do it again.
Yeah. So when you think about Latino political empowerment, what are the things that come to your mind in terms of you have to have, I think, mobilization and the incredible mobilization efforts that have happened from the Chicano moratorium to the
marches. 187.
187, and then the 2006 immigrant rights marches. Think about those three different eras: Chicano moratorium, 187, and then in 2006. How were they similar? How were they different?
I think each had their place in history. They were the culminations in many respects of what was going on. Each led to the next, iteration of it. Remember, the Chicano moratorium was only 25,000 people.
Right.
I mean, that was, in 06, that was just a weekend.
That's right.
That was very modest.
At different times, a lot smaller population.
Smaller
back
population.
In 70s, don't have social media. We didn't have the ability,
No, that's why I said each one created a foundation for the next. 187 was very significant to have immigrants resist and respond to that type of, racism, that type of hysteria, that jingoism, all that was taking place, to have immigrants play such a leading role in that. This was not the 30s, more organized, more prepared, more thoughtful. And that laid the foundation. From there, I looked at a picture today, emerged with the Dreamer generation, right? And emerged the movements that exist today for comprehensive immigration reform. So those were very, very significant and led to the next ones. The ones in 06 were just, amazing. Yeah. Just amazing. Millions and millions of people throughout major cities of this country. Extraordinary young people, just.
But they caught a lot of people by surprise.
Yes.
I mean, this is one of those where you talk about parallel lives. La Opinión was writing stories about it. Okay, the LA Times did not write a story about it until the day after. Actually, they had a media advisory that you might be careful in terms of traffic. They had that. Okay. And I remember the immigration reporter for the LA Times, when I talked to her and said that, she goes, "Oh, no, I knew it was going to happen. I told my editors." I said, "That's exactly the point. You're telling me that the immigration reporter, you, told your editors that this was happening. And so it's not that they were even ignorant. They knew that this was going to happen, and they still didn't cover it."
Right.
I mean, that's pretty amazing. The idea that the Times will do that today is almost, they don't want to be caught short on that. But it's an amazing... were you caught by surprise, the size?
Yes, because I'd been involved in organizing the efforts against 187. So the infrastructure requirements are amazing, right? To get the restrooms.
You mean the organizing?
The organizing of the actual physical, physical preparation for that. The stage, the PA system, the number of porta potties you need, the security, all this is very, very complicated, very costly, very difficult to do. How to move people, right? When we did 187, we spent, $100,000 on buses to bus people in. So I just was skeptical when I heard the numbers and the projections. Activists always like to project optimistically. And so, I was surprised. I wasn't listening to Spanish language radio all day and, hearing the mobilization. This was really an expression of a unity of all the radio disc jockeys. And so that's not what I listened to, right? I have my CDs, I listened to jazz, so I wasn't paying attention to that.
Back to the Channel 34 days when you wanted to change the channel, right?
So, but what clued me to this was I drove into the Capitol. You drive in, you go through a gate, you go underground parking, and the guy who takes our car, he tells me, hey, I'll see you Saturday, right? So this is a little guy, Juanito, says, I'll see you Saturday, and I'm like, no, I'm leaving back to LA, on Thursday. And he's like, no, I'll be there for the march. And I thought, how would the guy who parks my car in the Capitol
in Sacramento
be clued in, and not only clued in, but preparing to go down to participate in this march? And I thought, this is going to be something. And it was unbelievable.
No, what clued me in is that when my 85-year-old mother that told me that when was I going to pick her up to go to the march?
Right.
And I was like, what are you talking about?
Right,
It's like, no, when are you going to pick me up?
Yeah.
So I had to go. I didn't want to go, but I had no choice. My mom made me go. So I was like,
good son. You're a good son.
Yeah. So she thought we were going to be at the front of the march because I'm a Chicano studies professor.
That's right.
Right. But it's like I didn't even know what was going on until she told me. So what's amazing though is I am convinced that more than half of the Latino elected leaders did not know what was going to happen. Because I was talking to them right before and right after. Now, they all afterwards claimed, oh, yeah, it's like, no, but I'm going to call you on that one. Because I was talking to you, and I was purposely asking some of them. They had no clue. No clue. Now, in retrospect, they say to me, well, those aren't our voters. I mean, they are our community, but those aren't the people that I'm constantly communicating with because that's not my voter base. So there is a distinction for elected officials where they distinguish who their voters are, who their contributors are.
Of course.
And who, I was looking at George when I said that, and then who the community is. Right?
No, that's just part of the realities we have to navigate. My district is very challenging because it's very, very immigrant. And so, I have to find the voters within those households, and that framework. But we do very, very well there.
Yeah. So we talked about Ed Royalbaugh, Richard Alatorre, Art Torres, Esteban Torres, Richard Polanco, Antonio Villaraigosa, Gil Cedillo. Give me your top choice. And it cannot be Gil Cedillo.
They're all top choice.
Yeah.
They're all top drawer. They obviously have played their roles within the framework of what history permitted them.
Right.
And I think that's the most significant thing. History matters. And so, for Royalbaugh, you could only do what he could do.
Right.
And he seemed almost alone in that early Bradley races, early races for council. What he had to confront, he was very courageous. The stories of him and Tony Rios and those guys at CSO pushing the envelope. Richard and Art, just taking that and then running with it and expanding it and creating more space, not just in a small community, but trying to break down the doors so that we could participate in the entire society. Obviously, the next generation had its place, and now we hand it off.
So who's the MVP? I know it's tough, but we have to have an MVP. There's only one MVP. There's a lot of members of the team, but there's one MVP.
Well, I think it's important those who come first always have to get their appropriate acknowledgments. And Royalbaugh was that. But don't forget the role that the Burt Coronas played.
Absolutely.
In championing and creating the social base for them, the conditions and circumstances for which they could be there.
Yeah, it's a great book on Burt Corona that has been recently published.
But not enough. There's only one or two, and there needs to be more. Because our history isn't made around one person. And there's many, many champions for our community, men and women.
Yeah. So if I'm going to write a Wikipedia page about you, what should the first sentence say?
No, that's for you to figure out.
That sounds like one of the midterm answers I have for my students. I don't know. It's like I missed that lecture.
Right.
Yeah. Looking to the future, under 35, current civic political leader, Latino or non-Latino, just give me three that you say, hey, watch these three guys. They're the future of LA or California politics.
I spent an evening, and I've spent time with him before. Julian Castro is very impressive.
Mayor of San
Mayor
Antonio.
of San Antonio.
His twin brother is a member of Congress.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very, very impressed by him.
But I did say LA or California.
LA, California, I know.
And although Julian Castro comes to LA quite a bit.
Right.
For political contributions.
Drives himself, no staff. I was very impressed by that. You know, I'd have to think about that. I can't think who comes to mind right now.
Who has surprised you most on the LA City Council? Because you didn't know them all. I mean, you might have interacted with them here or there.
I actually knew almost all of them, and I have new views of them. So I love Tom LaBonge because history is very important to him, and I think we need a historian on that council to
He'll
let
be
us
gone
know.
in 2 years.
I know. Give us a framework for the decisions we make today and what they mean for the future. So I really appreciate him more than I did in the past. Krikorian is a very thoughtful man, very deliberate, very thoughtful, represents his community well. So those two I've been very, very impressed with.
In December of 2014, Gloria Molina is going to be termed out from County Board of Supervisor. And she's basically let it be known that she's not running for another office. And so, you know, she got elected to the first Latina ever elected to the LA, to the state legislature, first Latina elected to the city council, first Latina elected to the County Board of Supervisors. A tremendous person, that she will be gone. She was a counterweight to some extent to some of the people that we've talked about. Much more, in some ideas, much more progressive, much more ideological, not concerned about coalition building if it didn't fit her right. What do you think about her style and the way she managed at the County Board of Supervisors?
Well, I appreciate her leadership. I think she lives by her convictions. I appreciate her focus on service and being responsive to constituents. She's created an app, actually, that I think the city uses and many local governments use, just to be responsive. And so I think that service,
So do you
servant
think she
leadership.
has a Twitter account?
No. No, I don't. I think service leadership is very important to her, and I think it's something that we would all benefit if she focused on teaching that. I think she's been very focused on the community and been let the community guide her career, and so that's also admirable.
She so obviously she's not going to run for re-election. She's termed out. So why don't you run?
You know, I'm not interested in that type of governance that the county office is. It's comparable to the city, just much bigger, and it's kind of difficult to be in touch with it.
So who would
very
be
diverse.
Who would be the ideal candidate?
Well, I mean, I think the candidate that everybody talks about is going to be the former Secretary of Labor, Hilda Solis.
So is she the only one?
It appears that she's going to be the only one.
That doesn't seem very democratic. I mean, we're talking about
she built a consensus.
We're talking about a district of 2 million people, and you're telling me there's only going to be one candidate? That sounds like what the Soviet Union used to do. There'd be one candidate.
It could also be just she's developed a consensus, and so there's nothing necessarily virtuous about the fact that there's more candidates running. She is the candidate.
There's got to be like multiple centers of power. There just can't be
Well, we'll see that when the election comes.
So you think that's a good thing that only one viable Latino candidate for probably what I would consider the most important Latino seat, that it's just nothing against Hilda Solis. I probably would vote for her if I was in that district.
Right.
You know, but from my professor's hat is like that's not that there should be competition.
Well, I don't know that that's the case, right?
You don't know what's the case.
That there should be
that we should be
competition.
democratic or
No. I don't know that it's not going to be
Competition is
democratic. Okay. I don't know.
So
if
are you
that's
part
the
of this
case.
consensus?
No. I'm just making an observation of,
Well, I'm making an observation. I don't think it's good for the political system that we anoint one individual and just say, hey, this is it. Even if that is the best individual. If that is the best individual, competition would permit that. Now, the practicality is that to run for county supervisor costs a lot of money.
Yep.
Labor spent over $8 million for a candidate last time around. Mm-hmm. And so if she's the candidate of labor, and is she?
I assume that she would be. She was their Secretary of Labor.
Right. That it would be very difficult to defeat a candidate like that. But it's still not a good thing.
Well, look, candidates can emerge. People can choose to run. They can raise money. I'm sure there's strategies to beat her. I mean, I don't think she's unbeatable. And I think that's why you have elections to determine who's the better campaigner.
Okay, let me just make one comparison, and I'll stop with this. Okay. Xavier Ostovsky is also being termed out.
Right.
Same time, same type, same jurisdiction, et cetera, different district, obviously.
Yeah. I think he was unopposed most of his career.
No, not when he ran. The first time he ran, he was not the consensus candidate. He actually was not supposed to win. He wasn't even supposed to come in third place. Mayor Bradley was endorsing somebody else, and he barely won. Mm-hmm. When he ran for supervisor, he also had a couple of. But my point.
He was a walk-in.
Okay, here's my point.
Because he was our guy.
Okay. Your guy.
Yeah, we walked him in. He forgot that a few weeks later, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's funny. Funny how that happened.
Yeah, I thought it was hilarious.
Walking across campus, I see a current student. I call them over. They always come over, no problem. After the semester, they avoid me. They're like, they don't care. So I understand the feeling. But in the 3rd district.
Yeah, but they don't want to take your job. Yeah. Go ahead.
I wanted to take my job. There's a former student right there who's a professor right now in political science and Chicano studies. He's got my job.
There you go.
I'm actually sharing it. I still have my job. But
in the 3rd district.
In the 3rd district, Xavier Ostovsky is also termed out. There are at least 4 or 5 people that they're talking about are going to run, including Krikorian that you just mentioned, mm-hmm. including Sheila Kuehl, mm-hmm. Shriver from Santa Monica, et cetera, et cetera. That's a good democratic community. I'm saying that I have a problem, and it's bad for Latino politics that only one person emerges in such an important position. It's bad. How come we're depriving the Latino voters? Why is the Latino political elite depriving the Latino voters of making a choice?
I don't know that anybody's depriving anybody from making a choice. Anybody can decide to run. You mentioned my congressional run. That was very robust. There were a lot of Latino candidates. The result was we diluted the vote, and we lost a seat.
But the conditions were different.
Yes,
there was no runoff in your congressional race because it was a special election.
Correct.
And so that meant the top vote getter, even if they didn't get 50%, were going to win. In this election, there's a runoff, so that if several Latinos run and a non-Latino runs, comes in first, they still have to face the second place candidate who's going to be Latino. And I'm not talking about a non-Latino running in that district. I'm talking about 4 or 5 Latinos running in that district. And I think it's just troubling, and I think it's bad for Latino politics. I don't think it's a good idea.
You should get a candidate to run then.
First I have to get $8 million. Then I can get a candidate to run. But I will probably still end up voting for Hilda.
Okay.
So, we're going to do something a little bit different. We are honored to have 2 people here in the audience that I actually want to call on to ask you some questions, because while you've been evading some of my questions.
You know I won't evade theirs.
I know you won't evade theirs, okay? So I'm going to call on Monica Lozano, who is CEO of Empremedia, which owns and runs La Opinión, a paper started by her grandfather.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to have her ask you a couple of questions and see how you evade those. Okay.
The camera on her.
Thank you. Fascinating, and of course, we've admired your career and call you a friend, and what you've done representing our community has really been extraordinary. But I was struck by something as both of you were talking, and also as I looked at the people whose names are on the list around the political power shift, and there are no women on that list.
Yes.
And we start with giants like Ed Roybal, and we go through Richard Polanco, Generation 1, 1.5. And we talked about how this political empowerment of the Latino community, which has come to mean so much, and yet the conversation was devoid of the role of women, Latinas.
Yes.
And Gil, you were just elected to the city council at the same time that the first Latina was elected to the city council 25 years later, after Gloria Molina. And the only time that you bring up Gloria Molina's name is at the very end, when we're talking about a transition from supervisor to the next. And we even mentioned somebody who was a cabinet secretary, Hilda Solis. So the question that I have really is around that political power structure. And do those networks work for women, or do they in fact work independently of a Latina political agenda?
I think that's a good question. It's your list, right? So you didn't have
it's not my list.
Supervisor Molina.
It's David Ayon's list. We're passing the buck around.
But
Actually, it's the list of elected officials in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Right.
And there was one elected official, Gloria Molina.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and
but
clearly she was carried the mantle or was the trailblazer. But there's others, and
Martha Scutia.
Martha Scutia, Congresswoman.
Lucille Roybal.
So the question is, why didn't many of those women that got elected to state legislature rise to, you mentioned Cruz Bustamante, you mentioned Antonio Villaraigosa. We have never had a Latina that has risen to the level of political leadership. So the question, Gil, really is whether or not these networks that were so important, the coalitions that allowed you and others to get elected, do they work the same way for Latinas, or do they have to do something different to be able to rise into political leadership?
You know, I don't know, right? I came through labor, and that was my route, right? Hilda was a beneficiary of labor, a product of labor in many respects. She was Secretary of Labor, so, you know, she's risen as high as anybody can rise in politics. Supervisor Molina, you know, cut her own way, tied to Roybal, principally, to find her space. Escutia found her space via Polanco, as did a half dozen other women. When Polanco expanded the caucus, it was through electing Latinas to the state legislature. Diane Martinez, Gracie Napolitano, now Congresswoman, Martha Scutia, Liz Figueroa, Deborah Ortiz. So all these women were beneficiaries of the network of the resource pooling and development of Senator Polanco. The interesting point is that behind them was, when they left, was not necessarily a Latina. And so Deborah Ortiz comes through her route in Sacramento and then leaves a void, and it goes back to the liberals of the city of Sacramento. Liz Figueroa, the same thing, switches back to Elaine Alquist. Martinez beats Judy Chu once, leaves, and the seat goes to Judy Chu. So many of these seats were filled by people, not by Latinas. And so, you know, I don't know what happens after that. Hilda Solis moves up to Senate, and then comes, I think, Marty Martinez.
Yeah, but
And then Ed Hernandez.
I think what's interesting, though, is what you're in your response. I constantly make the argument that if you only take a look at Latino elected officials and non-Latino elected officials, that there are more women as a percentage of the Latino elected officials than the non-elected. So at one point, when Latinos had 10 state senators, 10 out of the 40, okay, half of those were women.
Yeah, we're women.
If you take a look at the congressional delegation right now, there are 7 members of Congress, Latinos from California. More than half of those are women. And you can go on and do this, where Latinas have done extremely well. And the old stereotype that Latino districts, mostly Latino men, won't vote for Latinas is just debunked. That Latinos are more greater to vote for Latino candidates than non-Latino communities.
Right.
But then there seems to be a glass ceiling. We don't have a Latina speaker, even though we've had 4 Latino speakers. We don't.
Why was that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that
Because
comes
the
down
3 Latinas broke from the one candidate that we could have elected. And so Martha Escutia sat there, unable to bring in Liz Figueroa, unable to bring in Gloria Romero, unable to bring in Deborah Ortiz, the woman who she got engaged to her husband at her house. And
Wait a minute, Martha got engaged to Deborah Ortiz's husband?
no, Martha got engaged to
I
her
know, I'm
husband
kidding,
at
I'm
Deborah's
just
house. And so that was choices that they made. They knew the historic possibilities, and each one made a different decision.
Right.
Both.
So you don't. So I guess the question really was: is there a network that moves people up into leadership, and that Latinos are sitting outside that? And I guess I'm hearing not necessarily.
No, that's not the case, because in fact they've benefited. I think that when you bore down, they actually benefit from those networks, and have been able to come into power as a result of those networks.
But there's no Latina version of Emily's List.
Well,
No.
No, there's not.
not at that level.
No, not at that
Not
level.
at that
But there's an organization.
George, did you want to come
Hope.
up?
Yeah. So there's an organization called Hope that tries to
Right.
recruit candidates, but it doesn't
Right.
mobilize resources.
Well, Hope has created Hope PAC.
Right.
So they are trying to actually create a fundraising mechanism to run and
But it's
elect
difficult.
women.
The races I've been in, you've got to raise a lot of money.
Yeah.
The candidate is principally responsible for that. If in my congressional race, I raised $1 million in 10 weeks.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult. And
In your first race, you defeated a Latina.
yes,
Yeah. So you started the trend, man. You should have
I should have deferred.
Well, I
to the
just
power.
take note that there's no women on that list. George.
Thank you. We will pass this. Complaint along to David Ayon. Yes. George Pla from Cordova Corporation. His most important identity, of course, is a member of the Advisory Council to the Center for the Study of Los Angeles at Loyola Marymount University. Mr. Pla.
Cruz Bustamante, I think, has the best description. When he was being crucified for joining Machistas in the governor's race, he said, "You know what? It was a place for us to hang out with friends and drink beer." That's what it was. And so, but they really tried to make it something that it was not.
Right.
I wanted Gil to elaborate on something that I learned from him only in the last governor's race, Jerry Brown's race. I've run campaigns in the past, thought I really knew a lot about it. And what I'm talking about is campaigns, good ones, focus on people that are likely to vote. And that's where you focus your money and your resources, and that's how you get people elected. So as smart as I am, in campaigns, I'm focusing on Latinos likely to vote. And that indicates a certain economic income level, education level, and that's where you focus your resources. So Governor Brown early on is having a really difficult time trying to get elected. And even though he has an enormous track record with the Latino community. And if you remember the stats back then, Meg Whitman had something like 40% of Latino vote, and Jerry Brown was somewhere in the same range. Kind of shocking. But Meg Whitman was really pounding the airwaves with a lot of money, as we recall. And so the race looked iffy at that time, kind of scary. Could you really buy an election or not? And I talked to Gil about this, and I know I've made a commentary, but I really want him to elaborate on his understanding of the voter. What he tells me, as we're trying to help Jerry Brown, it's like, no, you're focused in the wrong area. You need to focus on the immigrant. You need to focus on the immigrant who recently has become a citizen, registered to vote, because they vote in some astounding number, 80, 90%. And I was shocked. As much as I thought I knew about this, I was really shocked about that. Once he convinced me of it, we launched an independent committee aimed at this electorate. And Jerry Brown's numbers in time, Nanny Gate helped a lot. In time, the numbers jumped from 37, 40% to 70 and 80%. And I want you, Gil, to tell us, how is it that you knew that and nobody else did?
It was my political experience. It was my bias, obviously, since the beginning, but it was my experience in the '97 campaign. And it was what I had learned watching the mega marches and the mobilizations and just looking at the demographics. Our community has changed, and in the electoral arena, there is this body of Spanish-speaking voters that is equal to all the other Mexican-American votes. And these are immigrants who have either become citizens through IRCA or the children of immigrants who have turned 18, as they do every day, who are interested in the political process. And they're inspired by the Dreamers, by their family members. Working on this issue, I cannot tell you how many conversations when we worked on the DREAM Act where people said, you know, I had a young man come in and say, I really appreciate what you're doing. He was 19, he was a freshman. And he says, because it's really going to help my sister. Not him, because he was born here, but his sister was like 22 and a senior. And so that division exists in these households, and the younger people who are turning 18 are voting for their family and voting for their family interests. Those who were transformed through IRCA Proposition 187 remember, and there's a growing divide around the politics of the Republicans and the Democrats, and that those two groups, the adults and the youth, are voting for the Democratic candidate because they know that the Republican Party has abandoned this body.
So I am convinced that we are too close in time, but that in 20 to 30 years, when we talk about the power shift, people are going to meld Roybal to Villaraigosa, Cedillo, all in one. Right now we're talking about, you know, the first generation 1.5 or whatever. Right. In 30 years, they're just going to talk about the early ones, and they're going to talk about Antonio. And I'm also convinced, again, it's too early, that Antonio is going to go down as one of the greatest mayors in the city of LA. If you think about, he had the highest approval rating of any of the last or any mayor who's left office in the last 40 years. The highest approval rating when he left office, number one. Number two, with a growing Latino population, you always love someone after they've been gone for a while. And when you try to talk about the Latino political narrative, it's Latinos, Chicano studies that's going to start writing the history of LA, and they're going to look to a hero, and it's going to be him. And he's going to be projected as someone who is the epitome of the new LA, et cetera. And so he will ride that, I think, to an incredible legacy. And we'll be talking about how he, as mayor, jumped into burning houses and saved puppies and things like that, and make up stories like that while he was shining shoes at the same time, or something like that.
And one hand,
with one hand tied behind his back, you know. So, Gil Cedillo, public servant.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to Loyola Marymount University. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Pleasure.